What are you doing, Bill? Can a man drink that much? Lamented neighbor Mrs. Hargreave. She looked reproachfully at Bill, who was like a son to her. I'm in grief, don't you know, Mrs. Hargreave? Bill whispered, crying and swaying at the table with the drink in his unsteady hand. His red swollen eyes looked distracted and vacant. His cheeks and chin were covered with long stubble, which made him look miserable and untidy. Mrs. Hargreave wrinkled her nose. Yes, you are grieving, but she's grieving too. The woman pointed her hand at the little crying girl huddled in the corner of the sofa, and looking from there frightenedly at her father. She may be 100 times more hurt and scared than you are. She's only 6 years old, and not only has her mother died, but her father has turned into a monster. Mrs. Hargreave stood in the middle of the room, her eyes sparkling angrily. She turned to the little girl and spoke to her. Now her voice sounded very soft and gentle. Come with me, Esther. Daddy will come and get you when he gets a little better. Esther immediately responded to her neighbor's affectionate appeal, ran up to her and wrapped her little arms around her. Her little eyes looked hopefully at the kind elderly woman. And you, Bill, get yourself cleaned up and stop drinking. Esther will stay with me for a while. And remember, you are the most dear person in the world to her now, and you have to think about her first now, and not about how you're hurt and miserable. Mrs. Hargreave took the girl and left. There was an oppressive silence in the house. Bill's hand reached for his glass, but he suppressed that impulse. Mrs. Hargreave is right. It is necessary to live at least for Esther. The man collapsed face down on the sofa and tried to forget himself in an anxious sleep. Before his eyes, as on a film, flew all his family life. Here is his beloved Helen, beautiful and happy in her wedding dress. She happily tells him, you and I are going to live happily ever after. And then suddenly a very recent picture came to mind in which she, pale, exhausted by illness, with a headscarf on her head, was speaking again. But now her voice sounded quiet and sad. You should take care of her, Esther. Don't leave her. Bill shuddered at these memories and cried again, this time of great shame in front of his wife for not coping. A few days later, he, clean-shaven and sober, stood on Mrs. Hargreave's doorstep. Hello, I've come for Esther, he said with excitement. Oh, you have come to your senses. The older woman looked at him sternly over her glasses. Well, come in, but you need to wait. I've put Esther to bed after lunch. She needs daytime sleep now more than ever. So you and I will drink tea meanwhile. I have baked donuts with her. Thank you, Mrs. Hargreave, for shaking me up. They sat at the table and talked quietly, reminiscing while little Esther was sleeping, curled up on the old couch. That's how my son used to sleep, Mrs. Hargreave said, looking at the girl. He was so cute. And then he had an accident at work. It was like I lost my meaning in life. I didn't know why I live, why I work. You are luckier than me, Bill. Look, there's the meaning of your life sleeping on the couch. Esther woke up exactly 1 hour later. As soon as she opened her eyes, she immediately rushed off the couch and jumped on her father's lap. She happily stroked his shaven cheek, saying, Daddy, my daddy is back. At this point I would like, of course, to say that everything had settled down, but that would not be quite true. Sometimes Bill would get depressed again and he would drink again. And once again, Mrs. Hargreave would take Esther to her place for a couple of days. Time went by. Esther went to school. She studied well, and Mrs. Hargreave was always ready to help if Bill suddenly went out of order for a few days. And then one day Bill brought a woman home. Daughter, meet Paula. She's going to live with us and I hope you'll be friends with her. A beautiful tall woman looked at the girl, slightly squinting her eyes and smiling. She was as bright as a candy wrapper, and Esther smiled at her. Finally, Daddy will be happy. He will stop drinking and crying at night, thought the little girl. And she was right. Her father adored his new wife, but her relationship with Paula did not work out. Everything was fine in front of her father. Paula was usually smiling and talking affectionately to the girl, but when he was away, she literally abused the child. Esther could not understand why her stepmother hated her so much. Not a day went by that Paula did not scold or humiliate her. The girl said nothing to her father. She thought that if Paula left, her father would get sick again, and he would start drinking and crying at night. Noticing that her stepdaughter unrequitedly accepts all the abuse, the woman became brazen and sometimes began to beat Esther for the smallest mischief. Each time the slaps grew stronger and more painful. What is this? asked Bill once, noticing a bruise on the daughter's arm. But Esther only lowered her eyes to the floor, hiding her tears, and said that she had fallen accidentally. She saw her stepmother looking at her triumphantly and haughtily, standing at the window and folding her arms across her chest. After that incident, Paula, remembering how her husband had found bruises on Esther's body, was now smarter and tried to beat her so that no marks were left. The little girl became thin, pale, and cried a lot. But still, she kept hiding the reason from her father. Then Bill decided to ask his wife about everything. Paula, there's something wrong with Esther. Maybe she's sick, he suggested. What's wrong with her? She should be punished. She's rude and lazy, doesn't even wash a cup after herself. She just mocks me. I treat her with all my heart, and she looks at me like a wolf. The whole time, Esther looked at her stepmother with her eyes goggling. She had no idea it was possible to lie like that. Esther said her father sternly, "What's going on? Why don't you listen to Paula? What do you want?" But the girl could not say anything. In shock, her eyes instantly filled with tears. "I want to go to my mummy," she finally shouted, and ran to her room and stayed there until morning. It probably would have lasted a long time, or rather, as long as Esther's health could stand. But once again, Mrs. Hargreave intervened. She purposely spotted Bill rushing to work. "Hello, Mrs. Hargreave." The man was pleased to see his neighbor. "You've completely stopped coming to see us. In vain, both me and Esther are really missing you." "Oh, I tried to stop by the other day to get to know your wife and to talk to Esther. But right then I had to go home." "Why?" wondered Bill. "If I tell you, you wouldn't believe me anyway. You'd better come home early from work. Best when Esther comes home from school. You'll see everything with your own eyes." Bill was on his way to work, and his heart was not in the right place. There was something in his neighbor's words that made him uneasy, prevented him from thinking about anything else but what was going on at his house while he was away. Why has a good, obedient girl become frightened, withdrawn, and worse at school? Paula says Esther is silly, but she isn't. She's always been praised at school, thought the man. A little later that day, Esther had barely come home from school when her stepmother met her at the door with a wet towel in her hand. "Well, come in, you poor thing," she hissed threateningly. "So, you want to go to your mother? Well, I'll give you such an opportunity. She's probably waiting for you there, you ungrateful little wretch." She slapped the girl on the back with a wet towel with a kind of rage. Esther cried, screaming in pain. "Stop it at once!" Suddenly heard Bill's voice from the threshold. He decided to take his neighbor's advice after all, and what he saw made his hands shake. "Bill, darling, I didn't do it on purpose. She just drove me crazy. Let's give her to your mother or to an orphanage. It's not my fault." "I don't know why she makes me so angry," shouted Paula. "Are you crazy? An orphanage? I'll put you in jail. I never thought you were capable of such a thing." Bill rushed to his daughter. "Honey, tell me where it hurts. Forgive me, my little one." Esther hugged her father tightly around the neck and cried loudly. All the tears she had not cried for all that time were rolling out of her eyes in a hail of tears. Mrs. Hargreave quietly entered the room and looked with unconcealed contempt and hatred at Paula, who was packing her suitcase. "People like you should be imprisoned or isolated from society for life," she said to Esther's stepmother. But the woman only smirked in response. "It's not my duty to take care of other women's children. So why did you marry him? You knew he had a daughter, didn't you?" resented the elderly woman. "Are you really that silly? I just thought I'd eventually persuade Bill to put the girl in a boarding school." "Get out," shouted the man, still continuing to hold the girl close to him. "Otherwise, I'm not responsible for myself." Paula, with her head held high, rattling her 2 suitcases, walked away. Bill held Esther in his arms for a long time, saying, "Forgive me, my dear, that I didn't see or hear anything. You've been through so much. Remember, you must always tell me if you have something that worries you. I'm your daddy, and I'll do anything to make you happy. You're my joy, you're my life. And I love you more than anything in the world. And I love you very, very much, Daddy." A child psychologist worked with Esther for a long time afterward, and now the girl is fine. Bill did not marry again after this incident. It was enough for him once. He says that his daughter is dearer to him than anyone else in the world. And Mrs. Hargreaves is still helping them in the neighborhood.